Sadnhan. All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Hello friends, welcome to the second edition, the second part of the lecture on the features and particularly the literary features of the age of Milton. In the first part of this series, we had a detailed discussion on how the Milton's age and its various features are such an integral part in our study of literature. Particularly the age preceding Milton's age, that means the great Elizabethan age, overshadowed the succeeding age, that means the age of Milton, so tremendously that for a long period of time, Milton and his colleagues could not really come out from the shadows of the Elizabethan age. However, having said that, let us also be extremely clear about the fact that though Milton and his colleagues, great poets by themselves, were not really completely free of the influence of Shakespeare, Lilly, Marlowe, Kidd, etc., yet they were geniuses in their own sense. Ultimately, it was Milton who is even today the only English poet to have written an epic, Paradise Lost. And nobody, every critic, his contemporaries, down to Dr. Johnson, to Matthew Arnold, to T.S. Eliot, everybody has admired Milton's language, his poetry, his prose, which was simply brilliant and which was close to being a genius. So when we are discussing Milton's features, the features of the age of Milton, we cannot possibly let our discussion go by without giving special emphasis to John Milton, the poet himself. The poet was absolutely brilliant, as we have just noted, but then there were certain characteristics which characterize John Milton. Along with John Milton, friends, we also have to take into consideration a separate category of poets which are known as the metaphysical poets. I'm sure you have all heard the name of great poets like John Donne, Richard Crashaw, or Abraham Cowley, for example. All these poets belonged to the category, a very specific category of the English poetry. They were known as the Metaphysicals. So in this particular lecture, we are going to study the characteristics of Milton's poetry and the characteristics of the Metaphysicals. On your screen, when we come to the first screen, you will see the 4 periods of Milton's life. We are going to divide our lecture into the 4 periods of Milton's life and the metaphysical poetry. Milton's works can be divided into 4 periods. Please let us come to the first period. On your screen you can see the college period closing with the end of his Cambridge career. So let us not forget, friends, that John Milton studied in the University of Cambridge in 1632. Here he wrote the ode on the morning of Christ's nativity. So this is his first period, the college period. Let us come to the second period. It is known as the Horton period, closing with the departure for the continent. In this period, he wrote 4 poems of great beauty and power: El Allegro, Tu Penseroso, and Comus, and finally, perhaps the greatest of them all, Lycidas, in 1637. I'll repeat the names, friends, for your benefit once again. It's El Allegro, Tu Penseroso, Comus, and Lycidas. Okay, let's come to the third period, the period of his prose writings from 1640 to 1660. Friends, we have already talked about his prose in our prior lecture, so we are not going to feature or pay too much of attention to Milton's prose again in this lecture. In this period, he wrote prose works like Areopagitica, a great and impassioned treatise on the freedom of press, and that was written in 1644. To know about Milton's prose, friends, you will have to go back to the first part of this lecture where I have talked in detail about Milton's prose, his characteristics, and what was he actually writing in the prose works. We'll come to the fourth period. On your screens is the fourth period. Now this is going to be, friends, the most important period in John Milton's poetic career. And it is called also, look at the reference, it is known also as the poetic period. The poetic period, which was also the period of his greatest achievement. In this period he wrote Paradise Lost, the only and the greatest epic in the English language, Paradise Regained, and Samson Agnostis. Please get the pronunciation correct. This is Samson Agonistis. In this period he had turned blind and was suffering. This was something which was very one of the worst periods in Milton's life. He turned blind, he could not write, he needed the help of his daughter or somebody to write. But what is remarkable about this is, when the light from the eyes had gone away, somehow there was a divine light which came into Milton, and he produced his best known works in this period. Let's go ahead. Take a look at the characteristics of Milton's poetry. This is extremely important because we are naming the age after him. So therefore, characteristics of Milton's poetry become extremely important. Let us come to the first characteristic on your screen: lofty conception of poet's vocation. Vocation in the sense of profession. Milton was acutely aware, he was very conscious about the fact that he was a poet, and therefore he was extremely conscious about the fact that as a poet he had a certain duty to perform. He had a certain function to perform. So this is something extremely important. Lofty conception. He had a very high concept about, a very highly graded concept about the life and work of a poet. Let's come to the first point on in this particular heading. Milton had a noble conception of a poet's vocation. He always thought that the poet was almost literally some kind of an establisher of moral standards. So therefore Milton's conception of the poet's job was very high indeed. To him, poetry was a sacred vocation. This is extremely important. The world recognizes the profession of a teacher and the profession of a doctor to be noble. But for Milton, it was the poet who displayed maximum nobility. Come to the last point on your screens, friends. Milton never thought poetry to be merely an intellectual exercise and diversion. It was solemn, sacred, and divine. This is extremely important. It was solemn. It was not just something to be written and read, but he was passionate about his poetry writing. It had to be solemn. The meaning of the word solemn is serious, sacred, and obviously divine. Let's come to the second characteristic in Milton's poetry: sublimity. Milton's poetry is sublime and majestic. His poetry is enriched by knowledge and disciplined by art. This is something extremely important. He was not a haphazard or a chaotic poet at all. He was very conscious of the fact that I am a poet, and therefore as a poet I have to deliver something morally upright, deliver something which is morally correct and true to the world at large. So his poetry is enriched by knowledge and disciplined by art. His writings have a dignity and stateliness of its own. Just to give a very small example, friends, when you read Paradise Lost, book 1, there are 12 books in Paradise Lost. When you read the first book of Paradise Lost, how does it open? The book begins with such beautifully sublime lines of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree. Just listen to these lines again. of man's first disobedience and the fruit of that forbidden tree. Look at the loftiness with which and the sublimity with which he begins the entire epic of Paradise Lost. Let's come to the fourth point on your screen. His writings have a dignity and stateliness of his own. And now the last point. His poetry has an elevating influence. He always considered himself to be an establisher of moral standards and moral values, and therefore his poetry has an elevating influence. It needs to elevate. Elevate means to rise, to grow, to increase. Let's come to the third characteristic of Milton's poetry: love of beauty. I know many of you are going to question me, my friends, that somebody who was so sold out, who was so appreciative and careful about maintaining the moral standards, how can that person be conscious even of beauty? But friends, the reality is, the truth is, that Milton was extremely attracted by beauty. He was extremely passionate about beauty, and in fact you find in his poetry lot of dedication to beauty. So let's see the various characteristics in his love for beauty. Milton was possessed of a deep sense of beauty. Beauty, my friends, does not exist only in moonshine and near the lake and by the riverside, but beauty lies, for example, the beauty of a relationship, the beauty of a friendship. Milton was an observer, a very keen observer of such beautiful things, and it is this beauty that he has described and taken in his art form. He was attracted by the beauties of external nature. This is extremely important. El Allegro and two, Penseroso. These two are extremely important examples, illustrations of poems dedicated to the love of beauty. The beauty of virtue had a special appeal to Milton. And for example, we have the poem called Comus. The beauty of virtue, virtues, honesty, virtues like being moral, virtues like being religious, virtues like being extremely upright, free of corruption. All these virtues had a beauty in themselves to which Milton was tremendously attracted. His love for the beauty of music is also found in El Allegro and two, Penseroso. This is very, very significant, friends. Please mark this. The song of the nightingale delighted him, and he described it as most musical, most melancholy. This is beautiful, the way he is describing. Let us not forget, friends, 2 centuries later, somebody called John Keats, or maybe just a century later, somebody called John Keats was also going to write about beauty and about the nightingale, and that too in a melancholic strain. So perhaps Keats too, or Shelley too, had read about John Milton. Come to the last point on your screen. Adam and Eve's beauty has been described in Paradise Lost, Book 4. Beauty of being a man, beauty of being a woman, and most importantly, their beauty of being together. That has been taken into consideration in Paradise Lost. Let us move a little ahead after taking into consideration his love for beauty. Now let us come to number 4, Puritanism. There is a deep strain of Puritanism in Milton's poetry. This is very important. If you remember the first lecture of this series, the first part of this lecture rather, you will remember, friends, we talked at great lengths about Puritanism. How Puritanism became a national movement, it became a symbol for all the political and religious struggles, and most importantly, how Puritanism became associated with morality, with moral uprightness, with honesty, with all such virtues. Now, if Milton himself was a Puritan, how could he forget how could he absolutely not include Puritanism in his literature? His literature had to be influenced greatly by Puritanism. So there is a deep strain of Puritanism in Milton's poetry. Though in El Allegro and Tu Penseroso, there is not much trace of Puritanism, in Lycidas it can be seen in the violent outburst against the established church. I am again warning you, my friends, please do not consider Puritanism to be a religious movement. It was not based on religion. It was simply based on a thought which tried to say that there has to be a certain kind of morality in society, and morality which should receive maximum amount of priority. That was all. So in Lycidas we find Milton coming out in large violent outbursts against the church. The church, ever since its establishment, very often used to become a symbol of corruption, all kinds of corruption. So Milton attacked, in Lycidas, Milton attacked the entire system of the church, and unfortunately that church was spreading its tentacles in England very strongly at this time of the year. Anyways, let's go and see a little ahead. Milton became a stern Puritan in his later years, and his Puritan zeal almost killed his humanism. Sometimes in order to be morally correct, and sometimes in order to be morally upright and honest, we tend to deny, we tend to say a no to the basic humanistic values. Unfortunately, this is exactly what Milton did. On the altar of morality, he sacrificed humanism, he sacrificed humanistic values. But then, because he was so sold out and dedicated to the concept of Puritanism, one cannot really blame him for having done so. Come to the second point on your screens, friends. The Puritan spirit represents spiritual discipline, moral austerity, religious zeal, and moral earnestness. This is extremely important. Puritan spirit represents all of this. There is a spiritual discipline, there is a moral austerity, there is a religious zeal. The meaning of zeal is energy, enthusiasm, and moral earnestness. Earnestness, once again, is sincerity, dedication, devotion, commitment. Finally, look at the last point on your screens. Paradise Lost is biblical in theme and element. So the influence of Puritanism can definitely be seen in Paradise Lost, the greatest of all epics. We come to the fifth characteristic of Milton's poetry, classicism. Who were the classics, my friends? Let me remind you, all the Greeks, all the Roman authors in ancient times: Aristotle, Plato, Horace, Homer, Virgil, Dante. All these were regarded as classicists, classical authors. You had dramatists like Euripides, Aeschylus, and many others. I cannot recollect all the names right now, but so many of these authors who were regarded as belonging to the great classic Greek age. Anybody in England or in the European continent who followed the Greek classical authors were considered to be classically minded. So let's see whether Milton also was a classicist of some sort. Let's come to the first point on your screen. Milton's fondness of classicism is found in his selection of classical forms. The Greeks and the Romans, friends, had given us various forms. Let us see if Milton was following them. Epic. Of course, we have Paradise Lost. Greek tragedy. We have Samson Agonistes. pastoral elegy, we have Lycidas. The ode, which was once again a classical form, we have the ode on nativity of Christ. The dignity of his style shows classicism. That is what was the moralistic fervor. His fondness for classical allusions. What do I mean by allusions, friends? References. When he was giving classical references in his poetry, obviously Milton was showing that he believed and followed the great classical authors. Look at the second part. His elaborate descriptions and enormous similes in Paradise Lost. All these similes, descriptions, are all on the lines of the great classical Greek and Roman authors. His choice of diction, which is abundantly classical. So when he was writing Paradise Lost, for example, when God kicks Satan from heaven to hell, how does Milton describe that? For 9 days he fell and fell. Alright, so there is a kind of classical language which Milton prefers, and that trait, that characteristic shows his leniency, his bent towards classicism. The last point on your slides and on your screens, friends, Milton was attracted by the classical, which was pagan and sensuous. Paganism I have discussed and described and defined in my first lecture of this series. Paganism meant worshipping the trees, worshipping the rivers, worshipping seas, oceans, the sun, the moon. All these objects of nature were worshipped before Christianity was introduced in the world. So, later on, after people became Christians, accepted Christianity, anybody who was still worshipping the trees, the rivers, the lakes and seas and oceans, etc., were considered to be pagan. However, with Milton, now this is the funny part, Milton was attracted by the classical, which was pagan and sensuous. In which era? While I was defining classicism, I said, please remember Aristotle, Plato, Aeschylus, Euripides, etc., etc. Now, in which age or which time did these Greek and Roman authors exist? They existed much before Christ was born, sometime in 500 BC, 200 BC, something of that sort. So, therefore, following them, Milton also used lot of paganism, lot of sensuousness, just like the classical authors were doing. Alright, let's go ahead. Come to number 6. Milton's poetic art. Milton was a flawless poetic artist. For example, I will once again quote from the Paradise Lost. In the Paradise Lost, when Satan is asked by God or maybe by some angel, how do you feel having come to hell after being the chief angel of God in heaven? What does Satan reply? Satan says, it is better to rule in hell rather than serve in heaven. So, in this way, one can say that Milton's poetry was flawless. You cannot really possibly find even a single mistake. Come to the second point on your screen. Edward Albert writes, as a poet, whatever form Milton touches acquires a finality of grace and dignity. Now, this is something extremely important. His descriptive lyrics, El Allegro and Tu Penseroso, are unequaled in English poetry. They are absolutely gems of English poetry. Let's go a little ahead. His Lycidas, which was an elegy of course, surpasses all elegies. His Paradise Lost remains the highest poetic triumph of English poetry. For Milton, art of poetry was a high and grave thing, a thing of the choicest discipline of phrase. For Milton, poetry was not a day-to-day, everyday affair. It was not to be built or talked about in casual tones, but poetry was of the highest and the most serious nature. Let's go ahead, friends. Let's take a look at the seventh characteristic in Milton's poetry, Milton's style. Milton's diction is stamped with dignity, sublimity, and stateliness. This was the poetic diction of Milton. As a poetic artist, Milton is never careless or slipshod. Slipshod means chaotic, haphazard. He will not use words unnecessarily. He will not use words which do not rhyme. He will not use words which are casual in nature. So this was the greatness of Milton as an artist. There is hardly a line in his poetic work that is unpoetic. Everything that Milton wrote was absolutely and totally poetic in nature. Alright. All the words used by him were deliberately chosen to fulfill these three functions. Please mark this slide, friends. This is extremely important. The exact expression of thought, their power of suggestion, and the musical effects required for the verse. All these three functions were being fulfilled by Milton's poetry. The style of Paradise Lost rises to the height of the theme. Thematically, you can associate Paradise Lost with its theme immediately. A striking feature of Milton's style in Paradise Lost is his use of epic similes. I just gave you an example. Satan telling one of the angels, it is better to rule in hell rather than serve in heaven. See, this is a simile. And what kind of comparison Satan comes out with, rather Milton comes out with. Come to the second point on your screens, friends. Milton's style is noticeable for compactness, force, and reserve, and the unity of emotional impression. This is extremely important, friends. Milton was a conscientious artist and weighed every word he used for its meaning, weight, and sound. He was a conscientious artist, meaning to say he was an extremely careful artist. He did not use one extra syllable anywhere or one extra sound anywhere. He was so dedicated to preserving and uplifting his style. Let's go ahead. Alright, friends, that was the end of our part in this lecture on Milton. Now we will come to the second part in this particular lecture concerning with the age of Milton, the metaphysical poetry. I am sure you must be wondering what is the meaning of this term metaphysical. Let me describe it to you. You can see it on your screens also. Literally speaking, meta means beyond and physics means physical nature. The physical nature going beyond something. The term basically implies the process of dry reasoning, a speculation about the nature of the universe and the problems of life and death. It appealed to the intellect, not to emotions. I told you at the very beginning of this particular lecture, this part of the lecture today, friends, that the age of Milton is remarkable because we had not one, not two, but many number of geniuses in this age. Milton, of course, was one of them, but you will find, in fact, we will find any number of other poets also who were equally dedicated to the intellectual spirit of the age. And each one of them was extremely brainy, was extremely intelligent, in fact. It appealed to the intellect and not to the emotions. I believe that is the hallmark of this age. Let us come to the characteristics of metaphysical poetry. We have understood the concept and the meaning. We'll now come to the characteristics. Let's come to number 1. Delight in novel thoughts and expressions. They wanted to show something which was new, they wanted to bring in a kind of novelty. They did not want to go back to the old things again and again. The metaphysical poets desired to say what they hoped had been never said before. Alright, this is something extremely important. They cared to be singular in their thoughts and were careless of their diction. Friends, I believe this happens with anybody who knows a lot, number 1, who is very intellectually oriented, number 2, and who does not remain satisfied with whatever is offered to him or whatever is going on in the contemporary times. Perhaps this was the hallmark of all the metaphysical poetry also. Let us see. They had their own thoughts and worked out their own manner of expressing them. Let us not forget, novelty is what the metaphysicals were looking at. Sir Walter Scott once remarked, metaphysical poets played with thoughts as the Elizabethans had played with words. Coining new words, coining new expressions, coining new terms. This was the hallmark of the metaphysicals, nothing else. Let's come to the second characteristic of the metaphysical poetry, far-fetched images. A characteristic feature of metaphysical verse in indulgence in dissimilar images or discovery of resemblances in things apparently unlike. Please pay attention, my friends. Indulgence in dissimilar images. How will I explain this? If you listen to me carefully, friends, if I use the word apple, what comes into your mind immediately? A little fruit, this is the shape, red in color, sweet in taste. That is an image which immediately comes into your mind. But if I use a word like, let's say, blubberous, which is the name of a fruit, if I tell you, have you ever heard of this fruit? I'm sure you haven't, because there isn't any fruit by that name. But if at all, imagine there exists a fruit called blubberous, and I mention it in your presence, will you be able to understand what fruit or which vegetable or what product am I talking about? I'm sure you will not be able to understand, because you have never seen something like a fruit or a vegetable or anything which is called blubberous. So, what were the metaphysicals doing? They were bringing before us words and images which the common people like you and I, had never heard before. And in this way, they were trying to show off, literally, their intelligence. So please see this. A characteristic feature of metaphysical verse is indulgence in dissimilar images or discovery of resemblances in things apparently unlike, dissimilar. The poets said something unexpected and surprising and used hyperbolical expressions. This was their characteristic feature. They said something unexpected. For example, if a guest comes to your house, you expect the guest to come and say at least a hello to you. But what if the guest simply walks in and does not speak a single word and simply goes and instead of sitting in the living room of your house, goes and sits in the kitchen? Won't you find that odd? Well, I'm sure you'll find it odd. And in the same way, this is exactly the way metaphysicals were behaving, or rather, they were writing, not behaving. They were using far-fetched images, images with which the common reading public was not familiar. Alright. Let's come to the third characteristic of the metaphysicals, obscurity. In the task of trying to find verbal equivalent for states of mind and feeling, the metaphysical poets made themselves difficult to understand. We all do this, my friends. Sometimes we use words which are deliberately very sophisticated and difficult to understand, and by using such words we also think that we can perhaps impress the person who is reading with our intelligence. This was exactly what the metaphysical poets also believed in, and this is what they were trying to do. They used most fantastic language to convey the most trivial thoughts. So something which was very, very simple was being conveyed in an extremely difficult, complicated and complex language, because of which, well, the readers got an impression that the authors are the poets rather, are extremely well read and intelligent. And the metaphysical poets also received a kind of satisfaction that they have been able to bring out something which is not a very normal or a routine thing. So this is something which the metaphysical poetry and poets were most well known for. If you look at the fourth characteristic on your screen, friends, that is learning. They were very learned, extremely intelligent, as we have been talking about them. The metaphysical poetry reveals the scholarship of its poets. However, they used references from such remote and vague sources that common people could not understand. This is of the greatest importance. Hence, their scholarliness was largely wasted. Friends, if I start delivering the lecture, this very lecture to you in, let us suppose, the French language, or maybe if I start giving you this lecture in extremely difficult vocabulary and grammatical construction, will you be able to understand me clearly? I am sure you will not. Now, this is where the metaphysicals went very wrong. They did not understand that they should be using simple words which at least the readers of their poetry could understand. But somehow they never used that, and because of this, metaphysical poetry became extremely difficult to be understood. And as a result, their scholarliness, their intelligence levels were all wasted. On your screen is the fifth characteristic of the metaphysical poetry, religious and amorous. Metaphysical poetry was classified into amorous. Amorous, what is the meaning of amorous? Love poetry and religious verse. Amorous verse was largely written by Carew, Sucking, etc. Religious verse was written by Herbert, Crashaw and Vaughan. Okay. Now we will come to the discussion of some extremely important metaphysical poets. I did name a few, friends, at the very beginning of this lecture. John Donne was one of them, Abraham Cowley was another, Andrew Marvell was a very important poet. So after looking into the meaning of metaphysical poetry, getting into the characteristics of metaphysical poetry, we must now come and discuss some extremely important metaphysical poets. Let's come to the first one of them. On your screens, friends, you have John Donne, born in 1572 and he died in 1631. Not a very handsome looking man, looks a little stern with a very pointed beard, but then let us not forget that this is not a photograph, it is a painting. Okay. He was the founder of the metaphysical school of poetry. His works include, now see, look at the versatility of his. His works include satires, songs, sonnets, and elegies. Amorous poetry, his love poems are intense and subtly analyze all the moods of a lover. His language is vivid and startling. A vein of satire runs through his love poems. Look at a few of his poems. Air and Angels, A Nocturnal, A Valediction and Ecstasy are some of his well-known poems. His poems are all intensely personal. Donne's religious or devotional poems probe and question. This is an important part, friends, but are not sermons. They are confessions. Holy Sonnets and A Hymn to God the Father are well known. Donne wrote a satire, Progress of the Soul, which reveal his cynical nature. And he most of the times used the couplet form. Let us not forget, friends, the couplet form is the same form which was later on used by the great author Alexander Poe. We come to the second metaphysical poet, George Herbert, 1593 to 1633. Not a very long life, just 43 years of age. Well, Herbert's poems were published posthumously. This is very important, friends, and very interesting. Posthumously in the sense after he died. The Temple in 1633 reveals his religious zeal. Of all metaphysical poets, he is the most widely read because of clarity of expression, use of intelligible conceits and concrete imagery. These were the hallmarks of his poetry. His treatment of the religious themes is simple and earnest. He shows some quaintness. What do I mean by quaintness? Strangeness and some salty humor. He preferred simple, homely, racy language. He was not very far-fetched as Donne was. He was a careful poetic artist, precise and clear in expression, and very sensitive. This was the hallmark of Herbert. This is the third poet on our list, Richard Crashaw, 1612 to 1649, died at a very, very young age. Crashaw's best work is Steps to the Temple. Some of his poems are secular, but he is best in the religious poems. His poetry is noticeable for striking but fantastic conceits, religious fire and fervor. It is emotional, lyrical, and sensuous. We come to the fourth poet, Henry Vaughan. Please pronounce his name properly, friends. This is Vaughan. Born in 1621 and he died in 1695. Vaughan wrote poems, Salix Scintillans, began by writing secular poetry. He was a mystic at heart and more at home in sacred than in secular verse. His poems reveal his good intellectual power and originality. Vaughan was extremely popular as a metaphysical poet. This is important. He had considerable gift for fantasy and used it to decorate his serious poetry. He held nature in high regards and sometimes displays a closeness and penetration in projecting nature that it reminds us of Wordsworth. One of those rare metaphysical poets, my friends, let's not forget, who also wrote tremendously on nature. Let's come to the next poet, Thomas Carew, in 1595, born in 1595, died in 1640. Carew wrote poems in 1640. It shows his lyrical ability. He was a very well-known lyricist. He was as inflexible as Donne in style and strength, unfortunately, but he was neither obscure nor uncouth. Uncouth, the meaning of the word uncouth is ill-mannered. He was not that. Obscure means not able to understand. He was neither of these two. Carew's style and versification was so polished and refined that it reminded one of Walter. I am talking about Walter Scott. We come to the next metaphysical poet, Abraham Cowley, born in 1618, died in 1667. Cowley was a man of versatile literary interests. Look at him. He wrote poems, plays, essays, and histories. He wrote an epical romance, Pyramus and Thisbe. Can you believe it? At the age of 10. His well-known poems are The Mistress, the Davidess, and the Pindaric Odes. Cowley is important as a transitional poet, the last of the metaphysicals. His knowledge of ancient classics was unmatched. His lyrics were sweet and graceful. His couplets were not inspiring but were intellectual and imitated later by Dryden and Pope. That is important. We come to the last of our metaphysical poets, Andrew Marvell, born in 1621. He died in 1678. Marvell's poems are described as serious and secular verse. His work has the subtlety of wit, the passionate argument and learned imagery of the metaphysical poets. His rhythms are flexible and you find delicate melody in Marvell. So this almost completes our lecture on the metaphysicals, except for this slide. Marvell loved nature and her freshness, and there was sincerity in his poems. His poems deal with the theme of nature, Upon the Hill, Love, The Gallery, and To His Coy Mistress, one of the most famous metaphysical poetry, patriotism, the Horatian Odes. And we find in Andrew Marvell the metaphysical blend of passion and fantastic conceit. So that brings us to an end of all that we have taken in the literary features of the literary features of the age of Milton. We started in the first lecture by taking stock of the general characteristics, the literary characteristics, the prose and the essay form. In this particular lecture, we have now taken note of Milton as a poet and metaphysicals as poets. This phase was an extremely significant and an important phase in the history of English literature. So friends, kindly pay attention to all these characteristics and only then prepare your answers. Thank you very much. Hoping to see you again for another lecture on a similar series. Thank you.
Sadnhan, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.